So the camera, here we go. Okay. Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. Okay. Okay. So the question starts. Right. There's a hadith that I mentioned. I'm going to go one by one. So I'm just going to go to the original question. Then I'm going to come back one by one, inshallah. Case of contagion, history, archaeology, science, gender of the child. So the first there's the hadith in Sahih Bukhari, right? No, that's not the one I want.
You want the hadith about contagious?
No. So here we go. So there's a hadith, it's in Bukhari, it's in Muslim at various places, that the Prophet ﷺ said in various different versions of the hadith that when a husband and wife have relations, whichever of them reaches climax first, that defines who the child, whether the child will be like the mother or like the father, right? That's what it says. So then you ask anybody who studies science, and you say, well, what on earth has orgasm or climax? What's that got to do with anything? Because as we know, when you study science, you're like, there's an egg, there's sperm, and there's genes and these things. That's got nothing to do with sexual fluid or anything like that, right? So we know that the sperm of a male has something to do with it, but that's got nothing to do with a woman. So like you read the hadith, you're like, yeah, it doesn't really make any sense, right? So it's like, how is that irrelevant, right? So some versions mention whichever of them is above, whichever of them is this, and so it's like, yeah, that doesn't make any sense. So then what do? I read this hadith, and I just sit there like, yeah, not really sure, doesn't really understand it. I guess the Prophet ﷺ was wrong, because it doesn't make sense, right? And I just quietly kind of just sit there and think about things. And the next time I hear something about Islam, like for example, that doesn't make sense to me or that I don't like, I already have some doubts in my head. I've already seen one or two hadiths like that don't really make much sense to me. So then next time I hear a hadith, I'm like, well, maybe it's true, maybe it's not. And I just have this whole system in my head that, I don't know, hadiths don't really seem to make sense. Quran makes sense sometimes, some doesn't. And eventually I get to the stage where maybe Islam isn't really true. And then when fasting comes along, I'm like, yeah, maybe I shouldn't really fast. When it's time to pray Jummah, it's a bit difficult, so I'm not going to do it. Challenges in my life come up, and my iman just goes down and down, down and down and down. One of the reasons is because I didn't know how to deal with a hadith that doesn't make sense. So I'm going to talk about this hadith in specific, but first of all, we need to go through three processes to understand how to deal with it in general. So what do I do in general when I come to a hadith or a verse of the Quran as well, and it doesn't make sense? What do I do? Right? How do I deal with it? Right? So I'm going to start off with what? The first thing is, you go to the first point is, so short answer, I'm going to summarize and we're going to go through one by one. So short answer is everything the Messenger of Allah said was true, obviously. That said, not everything that has been narrated from him is completely accurate. So what he said was true, but what they're saying that he said is not necessarily true, right? Because we have, for example, a sahih hadith and a weak hadith, right? And so not every single thing is true. So, and not every interpretation of the language used is necessarily true. So even if it's sahih, maybe the interpretation is wrong. So you read this translation of a hadith and you're like, well, that doesn't make any sense. So, well, maybe that's not what it meant. So there's two problems. Number one is what you're being said, that what the Prophet said was true. And number two is your understanding of what was said is true. So when you say what the Prophet said doesn't make sense, what you're saying is, did he actually say that, number one? And number two, did he mean that? Because you're comparing what you think he said and what you think he meant to what you know as historical fact or scientific fact, whatever. And that's where that confusion is coming in. And you're like, hey, that doesn't make sense. I'm confused. But you have to ask two questions first. Did he say that? And did he mean that? Right? Because that's where you're going to get tripped up. And the shaitan will say, don't worry about it. Just move on. And this is number one rule. When you are confused, ask. If you don't know what to do, ask. The shaitan just says, don't worry about it. You work it out. and just let that confusion in your mind fester and build, because he just wants you to be a bit confused, right? Classic, what is it? What's the classic boxing move? Right hook, right? It's just knock somebody off, right? Classic things you do in, to just distract somebody. So Shaitan just wants you to be a little bit confused, and then he can get you something else, right? So this hadith making sense or not making sense has nothing to do with you dating some girl. He's going to use it to do that, because he's going to get you a bit confused, and then you're not kind of like, I don't know really where I am. And then when suddenly a moral challenge comes up, he's going to get you, right? And so we need to make sure you understand things properly so that he can't get you from another side, right? So number one, what did he actually say? And number two, what did he actually mean? Because you're comparing what you understood versus what he actually said, what he actually meant. And you're comparing what you are told he said versus what he actually said. So it says, if we find a hadith that it is odds with known and established science, we must first ascertain whether the hadith is authentic or not. So is this actually a sahih hadith or not? Number one. Next, we must look at the various interpretive possibilities, taking a particular hard look at the various wordings of the hadith. So we say this hadith is not a da'if hadith, this is in Bukhari Muslim. So the Prophet clearly said that. Okay, fine, but are there more than one wordings of this hadith? Maybe, right? You might find a number of different wordings for it. If after this is still really no way to marry the hadith with known and established science, then we can safely say that the hadith is a mistake. So can you say that? Can you say a hadith is a mistake in Bukhari and Muslim? Yes, you can. Why? Because one hadith in Bukhari means that it's very, very, very unlikely that it's mistaken. That's what it means. It's like drawing someone's blood twice, 3 times, and doing the same test on it. Okay, but that test doesn't mean they have cancer. That test that means 90% they have cancer. So you've done a test 3 times, and that proof hardly ever fails. But it doesn't mean they have cancer. It means 90% they have cancer. So when you say, look, they do not have cancer, the test was wrong. So when you find a hadith in Bukhari or Muslim, the chance of it being a mistake is slim to none. Yeah, but it's still there. And so when you have a fact in front of you, and you have a 99% chance of being accurate and 1% chance of error, sometimes you can have an error. But what you cannot have is a conflict between 2 facts. You say, for example, is a fact that Noah's here. There's also a fact that he's not here. Impossible. You can't have that. It's a fact that, for example, the Prophet said this, and he didn't say it. It's not possible. So when you have a fact, you cannot have 2 facts that conflict each other. It's not possible. Right? It means that something's misunderstood. It means something else. Right? So if we have a hadith that categorically goes against something that does not make any sense, and there's no possible way to interpret it in any other way, then we know that there's a mistake, because the Prophet wouldn't have said something that doesn't make sense. Right? So someone has to push. Either your scientific evidence is wrong, or it's not even factual anyway, right? Or there's something else, right? But what we're not going to do is just like the Christians did in the 19th, 20th century. Oh, the Bible says the world's been around for 500,000 years. Oh, and that's not the case anymore because look, dinosaurs. Oh, leave Christianity. That's just dumb. That's actually a dumb process. Finding dinosaurs did not disprove the Bible. That was just a trick that people used to and already religion was being challenged anyway. So that's a dumb way of thinking, right? And for various reasons. Anyway, so it says, if after there is still really no way to marry the 2 hadiths, then it means that, and usually that's not the case. Okay, so first thing, science versus scientism. So we live in a world of scientism, not a world of science. Okay, what does that mean? It means we do sujood day in, day out, try 50 times a day to science. Everything science is true. Everything science says is true. Science, if you get into science, you realize, just like if you get into fiqh, just like you get into hadith, there's tons you don't know. There's tons you don't know. And to say, for example, it's a fact that we are this, it's like, no, the new drug can save this. The new drug, when you say any drug, for example, as a doctor, you're using something that works 50% here and 50% there. That's what you're working with. Something that usually reduces blood pressure with patients like this. Something that usually does this, right? Chemotherapy does not work. It just works more than it doesn't work. That's why we do it, right? And so, for example, when we say like huge things, well, God doesn't exist, the Big Bang, it's like, nobody said that. What we're saying is it seems like this is the case. Scientism is different. Scientism is like, this is the absolute thing. Make huge claims and make it like religiously and morally factual. It's like, no, but in science, that's not even true, right? Scientifically, that's not even true, right? So, for example, someone like my brother. My brother, he's not a scientist, he's a mathematician, right? PhD from Oxford University. He was doing statistical modeling of random of RNA molecules, right? What's statistically more likely and not likely. So he had to do for his PhD. He had to do a lot of research into evolution, and he realized nobody really knows what's going on. There's tons of things that don't make sense, right? Tons of things don't make sense. It's not a given fact that we are evolved from apes. It is a promoted fact that we are evolved from apes. It makes a lot of sense, but it's not a fact. No scientist will say it's a fact, really, but it's promoted. And in the scientific spheres, challenging it, you're risking your career. So there is an agenda out there. There is a commercial, almost like religious sect about like evolution and these kind of things. But that's not what is scientifically the case. They're just saying this is what's happening, that's what's happening, right? And so this is scientism, which is promoting commercially in establishment, in universities, certain ideas, and not allowing these things to be challenged. If you challenge these things, you will lose your job. You will not be published. This is scientism, right? That promotes certain ideas, as opposed to science, which is, I mean, you test something and say, well, what is this made out of? Well, hydrocarbons, right? Like that's science. So we don't disbelieve in science. We don't accept scientism, because scientism is a religion which says everything that's new and found today is right and everything that's wrong is false, and nothing that can't be measured is baseless. That's the way that we think, right? And so that's called scientism, right? And it's promoted as just part of the way we learn science today, but it's different to science, right? It's two different things. Okay, so then we have fact, strong evidence versus stories. So when we are dealing with our religion, right? When we are dealing with a religion, for example, let's say read the seerah, right? We read the seerah. You're going to find things in the seerah that are fact. Things in the seerah are based on strong evidence. And things in the seerah that are stories, right? Someone like Ibn Ishaq, the author of Seerah Ibn Ishaq, he will say, so there's someone who lives 150 years after the Prophet or more, okay, 150 years after the Prophet. He says, I met so-and-so, who was a righteous person and was very knowledgeable. And he said, at the Battle of Badr, this happened. Say, well, the guy that you met, who was religious and very knowledgeable, what were his sources? We have no idea. So how do you even know that's true? So to question the Battle of Badr, full stop, you're questioning fact. That's historical fact. So we know that. And we're going to know certain things, what the Prophet said about Battle of Badr, this happened, that will be in a hadith, that will be sahih. These other things are just stories. Like, we honestly have no idea. Because somebody who lives 150 years spoke to somebody who lived 80 years after the event and is saying that this happened. Okay? So that's not a fact. That's a story. So we'll read it and that's nice, and we might see it and watch the film, the Risala, the message, and like, there we go, that happened. That's great. But that's just a story. You're not going to base your religion on that. It's a nice story, but that's all, right? It's said that Imam Abu Hanifa used to pray every single night, and this happened. Where is that? Oh, it's in book so-and-so, from so-and-so. Where's the source for it? I don't know. It's just a story. So many things in our religion, many things in life are just stories. They're just stories. We do not base our halal, haram on stories. We don't base our creed on stories, right? Many things are based on strong evidence. We base our halal and haram on strong evidence, right? A sahih hadith that says this is halal. A sahih hadith that says it's haram. A strong evidence from X, Y, and Z that suggests that the Prophet ﷺ forbade something or allowed something, right? That's called strong evidence. That's not fact, though. So a sahih hadith is not a fact. Sahih hadith is strong evidence. When Imam Abu Hanifa studies the hadiths of the Prophet ﷺ and the positions of Sahaba and Tabi'een and comes to the conclusion that witr is obligatory and you're sinful if you don't pray witr, he's not saying it's a fact. He's saying that he's confident of that case, right? And when Imam Shafi studies the same thing and says, no, you're wrong, he's not saying that as a fact. He's saying that as strong evidence. So there is story, maybe, may not be. There is strong evidence, and there is fact. Fact is what we base our aqeedah on. Fact is what we base our aqeedah on. So there's nothing in our aqeedah that's not factual, right? So we believe, for example, many things, like Laylatul Isra is coming, right? It's 27th of Rajab, it's going to come up. There are many things we believe as strong evidence about Isra and Mi'raj because it's in a hadith, in one hadith or another hadith. Okay, but is that a fact? No, it's not a fact. Well, why? Because the Prophet said it's not a fact? No, because one person said that the Prophet said that. It doesn't matter who that one person is. He can be Sayyidina Umar, he can be Abu Huraira. He's still a human being. He is not a walking tape machine. He's not your iPhone that's recording the Prophet. He can make a mistake. He could unintentionally add something, unintentionally as a human being at the end of the day. So you cannot call that historical fact that the Prophet said that. Because only one person said that. Okay? But it is strong evidence. If you met Abu Hurairah, would you doubt it? No. If it's in Bukhari Muslim, that's what it means. It's like so-and-so said that so-and-so said, and these all people are legit 100% scholars, but still they could make a mistake. Right? Are there mistakes in Bukhari? There's mistakes. Happens. What can you do? It's a human being. Okay? So there is story, maybe not. There is strong evidence, and there is fact. Okay? So we read a Sahih Hadith, and it goes against historical fact. We know that if there's genuinely no way to explain this Hadith another way, we know the Hadith wrong. Simple as that. You narrate that the Prophet said something, but it doesn't make any sense because we know the opposite. Right? We're going to see examples of that. Okay. So that's our number one issue. Right? Number one issue is fact versus confidence versus possibility. So number one example, where the Prophet says something, we take the hadith and it doesn't make sense to us. So the Prophet ﷺ said, there is no such thing as contagion. There's no such thing as contagious diseases. La adwa. So it doesn't take me in the 21st century to question that. A Bedouin at the time of the Prophet himself said, what do you mean? Like, we live life, there's such thing as plague, we all die, people die of the plague. And he said, we have camels, there's one that gets sick and the other ones get sick. We obviously see it with our eyes. He said, no, the Prophet said it. Okay, so what's the process, guys? Number one, did the Prophet say it? Number two, did the Prophet mean it? Right? So you come to the conclusion, no, the Prophet denied contagious diseases. And we see contagious diseases, therefore the Prophet is false. Okay? But two processes. Number one, did he say that? Number two, did he mean that? So we see that the Bedouin then asked that question to him. He says, well, Rasulullah, with all due respect, we have a camel, it's sick, and the other ones get sick as well. So obviously there's such thing as contagion. What? Like, doesn't make any sense. You see it with your eyes, you're going to deny that? You say, well, the Prophet said it, deny it. Right? And this is what we find evangelical Christians will do. They'll be like, it says it in the Bible, it has to be true. So for example, it says in the Bible things like, King Solomon had 5,000 chariots. And the other one says he has 50,000. Oh, he had both. They'll do that. They'll say God can't be lying. And so they don't have a process, right? And so then when, it's no surprise when someone, hangs out with these people, and you know what? And they just leave the religion because it's so dumb, right? So what is our process? Did the Prophet say that? Number two, did the Prophet mean that? So if you come to the conclusion that the Prophet said it and meant it and it goes against fact, that means he's wrong, right? That's wrong. So if the Prophet was alive today and he says, no, there's no such thing as America. He was in front of you. It's like, well, you can't be a prophet then because here I am, right? Like, I can't understand. Rasulullah, do you mean like America is not a place, meaning it's not a good place? He said, no, there's no such thing as America. It doesn't exist. You don't exist. That can't happen. The Prophet would never do that because he's speaking from Allah and Allah would never say a lie. It's impossible. So it has to mean something else. So he asked him, Ya Rasulullah, what does it mean? Right? And the Prophet said, well, who made the first one sick? So what is the Prophet actually saying is that contagion is not the absolute cause, the ultimate cause of things. The ultimate cause of things is Allah. So he's not saying there's no such thing as contagion. And quite the opposite. The Prophet told us, if you see a leper, somebody with leprosy, then run away from him. Don't get close to him because you're going to get leprosy. The Prophet told us about what you should do when there's a plague, right? So obviously the Prophet acknowledged contagious diseases. What he was saying is, don't ascribe ultimate causation, ultimate control of the world to contagious diseases. Because at the end of the day, who made the first person sick? Who made the first camel sick, right? Allah made him sick. Okay, so the ultimate cause of everything is Allah, right? So where was the process? Was it that the Prophet didn't say it? Or was it the Prophet that you said that you misunderstood what he said? So then you misunderstood what he said, you weighed what you thought he meant against fact, and you said, oh, there's a conflict here, I've got to leave Islam. right? No. So you got to go through the process. Did he say that? Did he mean that? Okay? So that's one example, right? But what we cannot do, fundamentally, you cannot say, what would be fundamentally wrong is, no, the Prophet said it, you're wrong. You're wrong. I don't believe in contagion. Okay, well, what about this? What? I mean, it's in front of you. Do you deny science? Do you deny factual? Yes, I deny scientism, being overly obsessed with certain trends in science and making them fact, even though they're not fact. But I'm not going to deny the fact that I exist. Right? You say, La ilaha illallah, for example, there's no God but Allah. Well, there are gods in India, they have 1 million of gods. Yeah, what does it mean though? Right? It means there's no God, no one deserves to be worshipped apart from God. Okay, there we go. Otherwise you have a problem there. Right? Right? So if you take things, if you're not willing to interpret them properly, it won't make sense. Another example of critiquing a hadith against historical fact. Okay, this is under the title Critiquing Hadith Based on History. So sometimes we find hadiths that do not make historical sense. So in Sahih Bukhari, there is a hadith that quotes the Messenger of Allah ﷺ saying, indeed, a righteous slave has 2 rewards. So if you're a slave, you're owned by somebody, you have 2 rewards. And then the hadith continues, and I swear by him in whose hand is my soul, were it not for fighting in Allah's way, which a slave can't do. Right? A slave, if you own somebody, he's your property. He's not going to go off and fight in jihad because you're going to lose him. So you can risk your own life. You can't risk someone else's property. You can't do that, right? So it says, and I swear by him in whose hand is my soul, were it not for fighting in Allah's way and performing Hajj and serving my mother, I would love to die as a slave. What's wrong with that hadith? This is in Sahih Bukhari, by the way. What's wrong with that hadith? Exactly. Yeah, but the Prophet said it, so you have to believe it. So even though you know, and everybody knows the Prophet's mother died when he was little, that's actually wrong. Because the Prophet said, if it were not for serving my mother, then, and that's in Sahih Bukhari, if you don't believe in it, you left Islam. And you say, no, it's not like that. It's in Sahih Bukhari, that means it's 99% chance the Prophet said it. And the chance of error is negligible. Yeah, but what if it goes against historical fact that we all know the Prophet's mother died when he was a kid? So we can't accept that hadith. We're not going to accept it. So he says, so what do we do? So commenting on this hadith, and this is not something new, like, oh, modern scholars have worked this out. Like they knew it at that time. That's obvious. So commenting on this hadith, Imam Suyuti says, the words, and I swear by him in whose hand is my soul, are obviously the words of the sub-narrator Abu Hurairah. Because it is inconceivable that he, may Allah bless him, ﷺ, could wish to die in bondage, because his mother wasn't even alive. So Imam Suyuti is like, obviously that's not the case. So the hadith critics themselves, like Imam Suyuti, who memorized 1 million hadith or something like that, it's like, obviously that's not his words. So what happened was, Abu Hurairah finished off added to it something. The sub-narrator, the person narrating from Abu Hurairah, is quoting the whole thing as Abu Hurairah quoting the Prophet ﷺ. When in reality what happens is the Prophet ﷺ said, the righteous slave has 2 rewards. Okay, one for obeying Allah, one for obeying his master. Full stop, end of hadith. Then Abu Hurairah then says, and if it will not be good, if it were not for fighting jihad and being good to my mother and going on Hajj, I, Abu Hurairah, would love to die as a slave. So the point is, we cannot just come along and just bang our head against the wall. Say, well, history says one thing, yeah, but the hadith is something else. Just accept it. Like, just keep accepting it. That's what Christians do. Christians have a lot of these things, right? For example, the Trinity. God died on the cross, but God doesn't die. It's like, I just believe in it. Just feel it, you know? They have this whole thing, the leap of faith, literally abandoning the mind. We do not have that because this is a real religion, right? A real religion that makes sense. Their religion does not make sense, okay? Their religion does not make sense. It's very nice because it's all about being good to people. It's like the feeling. You just feel it, right? Just feel that thing, but don't think about it. So their religion is stories, with all due respect. So if you look at, for example, the Bible, it's just like if you took those sections in the Seerah that are just stories. A book that exists 150 or 200 years after Jesus says X, Y, and Z. Well, we don't even know who was the source for that. No idea. Just believe in it because they'll say things like this. Of course it's true because it's the word of God. Right? So that's like us saying, well, how could you question a hadith because it's the words of the Prophet? It's So no, the opposite. We were critical from day one. From day one, asking questions like that doesn't make sense. How could you say that, right? Aisha radiallahu anha, she's the first person to do that. People quote hadith like, what are you talking about? Like she heard Abu Hurairah quote a hadith. It was really, really long. She said the Prophet didn't speak like that. His words were not like that. She's not going to be like, oh, it's the Prophet, I have to accept that. No. It's not possible. I heard the Prophet, he doesn't speak like that. It doesn't make sense. You know, and so this is what we find. There's a religion that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala destined to be preserved because we were critical from day one. It doesn't make sense. I'm not going to accept it. Right? I'm not going to accept it. So that's an example. So history against a historical fact versus Sahih Hadith. Okay, which one do we accept? So is it a conflict between historical fact and the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam? No, it's a conflict between what is ascribed to the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and he didn't actually say that, right? Because it's impossible. You have to be otherwise. Okay, critiquing a hadith based on archaeology. I'm just giving this as an example, although we wouldn't necessarily agree with the conclusions. Okay, so just as a process, I'm just trying to give you tools. I'm not trying to give you an answer here, just tools, right? So we have, the point is, the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam spoke fact, and what he says never goes against fact. That's what we're saying. So how do we deal when it seems to be a conflict? Number one, we're going to say it's not his words. Number two, we've misunderstood it. Number three, this. Number four, that. Right? Ahlan wa sahlan. Khosh amadid. Right.
Everyone stop looking at him.
Alhamdulillah. What's going on, bro?
Alhamdulillah,
Alhamdulillah, bad, bro.
just really happy to see you.
Alhamdulillah. Alhamdulillah. No, I'm just faking it because I'm on camera. So. I'm joking. Okay, the next thing is what? Critiquing a hadith based on archaeology. So archaeology, we don't know everything about archaeology, right? So, but there are certain facts. For example, you come along and say, so either the Bible's true and dinosaurs don't exist, or the Bible's false and dinosaurs exist, right? That's a false dichotomy. It's not even true. But anyway, this is what people did. They're like, oh, we found dinosaurs. Oh, I can't believe in religion. Oh, just leave religion, right? It's not like that. So are we going to do the same thing? What if you find archaeological evidence that contradicts the hadith? What are you going to do? We're going to do the same thing. Did the Prophet ﷺ actually say that? Number two, could the Prophet ﷺ's words be understood in another way? Okay? So, right? So we said a Sahih hadith is not mass transmitted. It's one person narrates it, two people narrate it from the Prophet ﷺ. It gives us great confidence. We have great confidence. We're here, but it's not a fact. So if one person, if one Sahabi says a hadith, it's not a fact. It's here. We have to accept it, we have to believe it, we have to act upon it, but it's not a fact. Right? It's not a fact, unless it's widespread from the Prophet ﷺ. Okay, so here we have an example of Ibn Hajar al-Asqalani, someone who 500 years in Egypt, and he's commenting on Sahih Bukhari, and he says the hadith goes against archaeology, right? Now, how much archaeological evidence did they have back then? Archaeology was just in its beginning stage as well. It wasn't really archaeology back then. But anyway, as a process, right? Somebody who has exposure to some archaeological evidence, and he's saying this goes against the hadith, right? So it says in Sahih Bukhari, there's a hadith that quotes the Prophet ﷺ saying, when Adam was created, he was 60 cubits tall. Does anybody know what a cubit is? This, right? That's a cubit. So that's what? That's like 1.5 foot. That's 2 foot. Something like that. About 2 foot, right? No idea. What's a foot? You know what a foot is?
Yeah.
Come on, bro. So this is called a cubit, right? This is called a cubit, right? 24. So that's about 24 inches approximately, right? So that means what's it called? It said 2. So how many yards tall? Really tall, right? So 60 cubits tall. That means Sayyidina Adam was about, how many foot?
30 foot tall.
30, no, more than that, 60 of these. So it's about 120 foot tall. So 6 foot person, he's about the size of 20 men. Okay? So you read the hadith, you're like, okay. I mean, and then if the Prophet said it, then it's true, right? It could be true, why not? Right? Miracles happen, why not? Okay? And then the hadith says, and people have continued to shrink until now. Okay? And this is in Sahih Bukhari. So the hadith says that Sayyidina Adam was about the height of 20 men, and until this day, since the time of Sayyidina Adam, people have continued to shrink until they're now about 6 foot, right? Okay, so it says, after confirming the meaning of the hadith, and that the words of the hadith did indeed indicate the Prophet Adam was still about 90 foot or 60 foot tall, Ibn Hajar adds the following. So this is Ibn Hajar al-Asqalani, one of the greatest hadith scholars. He says, what is problematic here is what is observable today of the archaeological remains of previous nations. Right? As, for example, anybody who look today is like, you don't find people in the grave that were, we find all sorts of bodies from 1,000 years ago, 2,000 years ago, 5,000 years ago, 10,000 years ago, 50,000 years ago, all these different remains of people. You don't find anybody that is 60 foot tall, 120 foot tall. You don't find anybody like that, right? So it's not necessarily a proof, because here it's talking about, maybe you just haven't found them, right? But as a process, right? And I need to understand the process that he's doing. And then he says, such as those of Thamud, since the size of their houses does not give the impression that they were exceptionally tall, as this would imply. Furthermore, Ibn Hajar says, it is obvious that they lived a long, long time ago, and the time between them and Adam was less than the time between them and those at the beginning of the nation. To date, he says, I have not been able to explain this problem. Full stop. So Ibn Hajar doesn't reject the hadith, but he just says, I don't know what's going on. So this is a perfectly traditional or well-established, the most referenced commentary on Sahih Bukhari, Ibn Hajar Asqalani. Right? And he says, don't know what's going on. He just leaves it like that, right? And so what Ibn Hajar is saying is, listen, he's saying, from what we see, that doesn't make sense. So what is he saying? He's saying, as far as I understand, Adam was so many thousand years ago. As far as I understand, there were these people who were quite close to that time, and they don't look that tall. And, unless we assume that they reduce an extremely, like, let's say, for example, his children were half his height, and then their children were half again, which is possible, it doesn't make sense. So what is the problem here is he's using strong, but not factual, archaeological evidence in his mind that goes against a strong hadith. And he's saying, listen, we have a conflict here, right? So it is methodologically correct, a sound process, to take certain historical evidence that seems very strong and to weigh it against a hadith that seems strong and say, you know what, I think this doesn't make a mistake, doesn't sound right. That's a valid thing to do. Why? Because Sahih hadith is strong, not fact. And you might find other evidence that is stronger, right? We do that in fiqh all the time. Sahih hadith in Sahih Muslim, for example, that says whoever fasts Ramadan and then follows up with 6 days of Shawwal, right? Imam Malik rejects the whole hadith. Why? He says, all the Sahaba and Tabi'in in Medina, they don't do that. In fact, they say it's wrong. So how is it possible that all the Sahaba in Medina and all these people say don't fast the 6 days of Shawwal, and how can it be a hadith? Right? So we might say, well, Imam Malik, maybe other people were aware of the hadith and you weren't, but for Imam Malik, he's going to reject that hadith, because how can all these people be wrong? So he's taking one evidence that's strong, it's not a fact, and weighing against another evidence that's also strong and saying one's stronger than the other. So that's what Ibn Hajar is doing. Ibn Hajar is saying, listen, I can't say historically that's the case, because again, we don't know when was Adam, we don't know how fast the people shrunk, we don't know this, but it seems problematic. So as a process, what if it was historically the case? We found DNA of Sayyidina Adam, and we found his body, and he wasn't that tall. Or we see him on Yawm al-Qiyamah. You see Sayyidina Adam, and he's not that tall. And you're like, well, the hadith can't be true then, can it? So as a process, if there's a fact that the Prophet ﷺ did something, he said something, and it's a fact that he meant it, and you're saying it's not the case, fine, we can reject the hadith. You can say, well, you can leave Islam now. Because he says, for example, Fareed Dingle will never exist as a fact. And here I am. Okay, then he's wrong. But do you know as a fact that the Prophet ﷺ said that Sayyidina Adam was sick? No. Because one person said that. That's all. One person who was really reliable said that the Prophet ﷺ said that Sayyidina Adam was 120 cubits tall. So you're not going to leave Islam over that. You're either going to say, well, someone like myself, I say, Allahu A'lam. I don't know. I'll have the humility, inshallah, to say I don't know enough about archaeology. I don't know enough about the world. If the Prophet said it, it was true, but I'm not sure if he said it. Or you might come along like Ibn Hajar or somebody else saying, you know what, forget that hadith. Doesn't make sense. Right? And there are other hadiths like that as well. I'm going to try and give another one where you have a conflict. And I'll give another hadith. There's a hadith in Sahih Muslim as well, similar kind of thing, where the hadith describes the creation. Right? It describes how this happened and this happened and this happened. It's in Sahih Muslim, right? And it talks about how Allah made the earth and Allah made this and made this and made this. Now the description in the hadith is contrary to the Quran. It's contrary to the Quran, doesn't make sense. Okay? And then many of the ulama of hadith, they realized that this hadith was sometimes quoted as the words of the Prophet ﷺ from Abu Hurairah to the Prophet ﷺ, and sometimes quoted from Abu Hurairah, and other times quoted as the words of Ka'b al-Ahbar, who was a early Jewish convert to Islam. So by putting the combination of the fact that the hadith doesn't really fit with the Quran, and the fact that who actually said this, was it Abu Hurairah, was it Ka'b al-Ahbar, or was it Abu Hurairah quoting the Prophet ﷺ? A number or a good portion of the hadith scholars like Bayhaqi and Bukhari, they said, you know what? This is actually a quote from Ka'b al-Ahbar, who was a Jewish convert quoting the Talmud or something like that. So this is a Jewish tradition that has somehow found its way into Sahih Muslim. That somehow, and now you're thinking the Prophet ﷺ said that. And how do you know it doesn't make sense? Number one, it's a bit funny when you read the hadith because it goes against the Quran, the Quranic description. And number two, you find all these other references to something else. And so what actually used to happen is that Abu Hurairah used to sit with Ka'b al-Ahbar and they used to teach people. So the Prophet ﷺ, Abu Hurairah would be here and Ka'b al-Ahbar would be here, and he would say, yeah, this happened in time of Sayyid Yusuf, and then people would listen to it. And he's there as well, and somehow there's a mix-up, right? How did we identify it? Was the fact that other narrations saying that he said it. And so it's Abu Hurairah was sitting there, and he was not quoting the Prophet ﷺ. And how do we know? The contents doesn't make sense, right? So generally, yeah, Bukhari, Muslim, ala ra'si wal ayn, as they say in Arabic. Of course, there's no reason. So just come along and ignore it. Oh, well, there's questions about it, just ignore it. No, that's wrong. But we are objective, and we can critique something, right? In science, they have a principle. If your scientific statement is incriticable, meaning I couldn't disprove it anyway, it's meaningless, right? So Adil says I'm the best, right? Okay, best of what, Adil? I'm the best. Like, what do you mean, Adil? You're like, I'm just absolutely the best. I say, well, okay, you the fastest in the world? No, I'm just the best. Okay, what at what? If he doesn't give me something to disprove, like you're the fastest, strongest, most handsome, what is it? Then it's a meaningless statement. It doesn't mean anything. Same thing in science. You say, yeah, cobalt. Okay, what about cobalt? It's more malleable. What does malleable mean? You have to define what you mean so I can disprove it, right? And so Islam, the beautiful thing with Islam is you can hit it and hit it and hit it, and you can find out exactly where is the weakness, what's right and what's wrong. You don't like something, dig, question. Find there's a hadith, find out, is it fact or is it not? Something halal, haram, where did you get that from? You can find out every single thing. You can't find that with other religions. You don't find that. You have a chain of transmission 5,000 years back to Buddha, mashallah. Do we know any of those narrators? No. Meaning, it's a meaningless chain of transmission. It's a meaningless statement. Every single thing in Islam you can dig at. You say, this thing happened. Is it true? Or is it just a story? Is it something that's possible? Is it this? Where is it? Your conclusion that you drew from this story, is it this or this? You can work out every single thing. If you don't like something or you're confused about something, if you have the courage to dig, you will find an answer. But the shaitan doesn't want you to have the courage to dig. He just wants you to be confused and just keep going. So they have a whole series of confusions in your head. And so then when a moral issue comes up, you're just like, oh, khalas, not sure. Like we were talking about last week or the week before. Meat. Yeah, eat whatever. I'm sure there's difference of opinion. There's always difference of opinion, yeah, but find out what the differences of opinion are, and you'll find that what you're doing is completely wrong. Right? As you mentioned, this position, music, the same thing. Oh yeah, I'm sure there's difference of agreement. It's like, hey, this is the deal. What else is there? Right? Keep digging, and you won't find anything more than that. Okay? And so here's as a process, right? What did we see? Scientific fact versus Sahih Hadith. Number one, did the Prophet actually say it? Number two, did the Prophet mean it? We're never going to find a conflict. scientific, historical fact versus Sahih Hadith, if it's really a fact, it means the Hadith is not right. And there's many cases like that. There'll be a Hadith that mentioned the Prophet ﷺ married so-and-so this time. He's already married to her 5 years before. That doesn't make any sense. Right? And so we'll point these things, we'll find these things. Or something that's convincing versus something that's convincing. So a strong evidence versus strong evidence, sometimes which is the strongest. So this is what we see Ibn Hajar doing here. It's not really archaeological fact, but it's very convincing in his eyes that it doesn't make sense that Adam was that tall. Very convincing. And so he's saying this is just a Sahih Hadith, not a fact. If it was a verse of the Quran, and if a verse of the Quran is very clear, then khalas, that's just a fact. But you will never find a single verse of the Quran that goes against science. You're not going to find it. You're not going to be like, it says this, and this is what we know in science, therefore the Quran is wrong. You're not going to find that. You won't find that. Okay, so we did archaeology. So now going back to the gender of the child. So the child, so here it says, so this hadith, number one, what you have to do, find the different narrations of that hadith. You're going to find many hadiths have very different narrations, right? So the hadith we said was when a husband and wife have relations, whichever of them reaches climax first, that determines with the gender of the child. And we said that doesn't make sense because whether, say with a man, yeah, at least his ejaculation has something to do with, there's actually genes in there, right? There's something alive in there that's going to impregnate the woman, right? But whether when she reaches orgasm or not has nothing to do with the gender or anything to do with the DNA. That's irrelevant, right? And so that's irrelevant. So it says, so let's look at the different version of the hadiths. So it says the first in Sahih Bukhari and mentions that a convert to Judaism asked the Prophet ﷺ about 3 issues to verify whether or not he was a true prophet. It mentions that, quote, as for which parent the child, so the Jewish basically is asking, are you a real prophet or not? Asking 3 questions. And so he says, what about this? And so the Prophet ﷺ says, as for which parent the child will resemble, when a man sleeps with a woman and his water/sperm, the words are unclear in Arabic, comes before hers, then the child will resemble him. And if her water/sexual fluid comes first, then the child will resemble her. So the clear thing is like, what's that got to do with the gender or the DNA of the child, right? And we can see that quite clearly. The fact that this person is a blue-eyed and brown-eyed, okay, the child turned out blue-eyed because of this gene. It's just something we know as a fact, right? So clearly there's a conflict between science as we know it and the hadith, right? Okay, another version in the same hadith, Okay. So another version in the same hadith in Tabarani mentions, it doesn't say which other comes first. It doesn't say sabaqa. It doesn't say comes first. It says overcoming, ghalaba, in place of sabaqa. So ghalaba, to overcome. Sabaqa, to come first. So that's 2 different things. So if number one, you have a problem, we would say, what on earth, particularly for a woman, what on earth has she got to do with it? Because her ovaries is something completely different. That's irrelevant. But number 2, we have another, in the 2 versions of the hadith, one hadith mentions ghalaba versus sabaqa. One overcomes the other. So is it one overcoming the other, or is it one coming first? That's a big difference. The second hadith is in Musnad al-Bazzar and is related by Ibn Abbas and states, the resemblance goes to whichever them overcomes the other. If they join, the resemblance will come from both. So again, it has the word ghalaba, nothing to do with coming first. So time is irrelevant. The issue of which overcomes the other. Okay? If they join, the resemblance will come from both. The third hadith is in Sahih Muslim and mentions that Sulaym asked about women having wet dreams. Is that even possible? Right? And it mentions that the Prophet ﷺ says, men's water/semen is thick and white, and women's water/sexual fluid is thin, pale/yellow/black. Meaning the words are used can have different interpretations. So you come along and say, is black? What are you talking about? Yeah, that's your translation that you read. So you leave Islam based on a hadith, one version of a hadith, and based on one interpretation of that word. The word asfar in Arabic can mean pale, can mean yellow and can mean black. Whichever of them comes first or precedes the other, that will determine the resemblance. So again, here we have time being irrelevant, which seems irrelevant, and it says her water / sexual fluid. So we now need to critique these hadiths in a way that explained above. So what do you have to do? We say, did the Prophet ﷺ say it? Did the Prophet ﷺ mean what you mean? If we can establish that the Prophet of God said that female sexual fluid has anything to do with DNA, then we can leave Islam. Because he clearly said something that does not make sense. You can just see that as a fact. But the question is, before you leave Islam, let's just ask the question, did he say that? Did he mean that? Did he say that? Or did he mean that? To answer the first question, we see that the hadiths are narrated in Bukhari and Muslims are therefore authentic, but are definitely not mass transmitted. So there's no basis to leave Islam on this, because you do not know as a fact that he even said any of these words. You think with great confidence that he said these words. So you should not be, it's not an issue of X or Y, because it's possible, number one, it's narrated that he said it, but he didn't even say it anyway. It's possible, not very likely, but it's possible. And it's also possible that we're misinterpreting the hadith. Okay, it's also possible. Okay, regarding the science, I think we can say quite categorically that we know that female sexual fluid or ejaculate has nothing to do with the resultant gene makeup of the child. And that women's sexual fluid, ejaculate, is definitely not black, right? Unless you've got some things. It may, however, be yellow, right? And here there's a reference here in the article to a journal that has other colors. Now, looking at the words used, the real conflict here is the issue of which the two reaches climax. When looking at the different wordings of the hadith, overcoming versus preceding, so overcoming is one thing, what on earth that means, and then preceding, that's obviously who came first, right? It is not too far-fetched at all that the narrations reflect the general meaning of dominance, and it wouldn't be wrong to argue that overcome was the actual wording and preceding was the paraphrasing, right? So imagine you're trying to explain it. Sabaqa versus ghalaba. It's kind of similar kind of idea, but it is different. We're talking about which came first, which overcomes the other, right? Number one. The question then remains of water. What on earth does that mean? Right? Like for example, the Prophet said, "Innamal ma'u min al-ma'." Water, i.e. having to make ghusl, is only necessary if you ejaculate. So ejaculate, semen, is called water, right? That's one of its words in Arabic, right? So originally, if a husband and wife had relations but they didn't actually ejaculate, they didn't have to make ghusl, and then that was abrogated, and they would have to make ghusl anyway, right? So the word water comes from that. Was it ma'in mahin was the verse? خَلَقْنَاهُ مِن مَاءٍ مَهِينٍ. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentions in the Quran, you're created from a maheen and a very low, something that a disgusting water. Okay, well, I'm not created water. What do you mean? In Arabic, semen is referred to as water as well, right? Right. Did we not create any? So who do you think you are? You're created from sperm, right? Okay. So what is most apparent when reading the hadith is that water means semen or sexual excretion. That said, although far-fetched in itself, I don't think it's impossible that it has a more general sense of sexual contribution to the fertilization process. So here we're looking at number one, we're not dealing with fact versus fact. So you can categorically not say that the Prophet of Islam said X, which just doesn't make any sense, therefore Islam's false. You can't say that because we don't know as a fact that he said that. Number two, there is strong evidence that he said it, and there's strong evidence that he's referring to sperm or female sexual fluid. But that's not fact. That's not necessarily the fact. It's possible, but not very likely, that he meant your general contribution to the whole makeup of the child, right? Like ovaries or something like that, right? Which is possible. So we can come to one of a number of conclusions. The first possibility, that we have simply misread the hadith, and there is no conflict whatsoever. This assumes that water doesn't mean semen or sexual fluid, and is not impossible, but arguably far-fetched. So argument number one, the conflict is, here we know from science, and water just means that, which is possible, but kind of a far-fetched interpretation. The second is the Prophet ﷺ never said these words to begin with and was just misquoted. This assumes the narrators, who were all very accurate and bona fide hadith narrators, made a mistake. This is also not impossible, but far-fetched. The third is that the Prophet ﷺ said these words to begin with, and that he was correctly interpreted, and he himself made a mistake. So third option, the Prophet ﷺ himself said something was incorrect. This would mean that he was not a prophet, etc. Okay, why is this invalid? This is an invalid conclusion because we are saying that he definitely said something that is definitely false, but we don't know that. We only think he said that. So your point is the third conclusion. Okay, it's either Islam or this. I'm just going to leave Islam on this hadith. Why? Why would you even do that? You know as a fact that for example, anything that would come out of a woman in sexual intercourse has nothing to do with the DNA of the child. You know that as a fact. Why are you going to leave Islam over Sahih Hadith? Because you think a Sahih Hadith is fact. It's not. We think the Prophet ﷺ said it. We don't know the Prophet ﷺ said it. By default, we would quote the Hadith, act upon the Hadith, fine, but there's a conflict here. Right? So you need to have a proper process. This is where tons of Christians left Christianity. Oh, dinosaurs and Bible. Leave religion. It's like, why? Does it it doesn't make any sense. Does the Bible even say there's no dinosaurs? Like, it doesn't even make your process doesn't even make sense, right? So we could either say the Prophet was misquoted, or we interpret the hadith in a really far-fetched way, but we cannot say leave Islam. That doesn't make sense. One of the two things: either the strong evidence is actually wrong, or the most likely interpretation of hadith is not the correct. Right? And these things happen. It's not a big deal. So conclusion. What's the upshot? When would we leave Islam? When I'm ready to Islam. Right? And this is a very important thing. We have to be confident about our religion. Confident that Islam is true. Confident Islam can be challenged. What does Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala say? قُلْ إِن كَانَ لِلرَّحْمَنِ وَلَدٌ فَأَنَا أَوَّلُ الْعَابِدِينَ. Say with as they say in Arabic, بِمَلْء الْفَمْ. Say with your full mouth. Say with all confidence. If God has a son, I'll be the first person to worship him. But God doesn't have a son, Habibi. You're completely wrong. If God has a son, if the Prophet ﷺ is a liar, I'll be the first person to leave him. So let's critique it. Let's look at his life. Let's look at everything. The Quran is true and the Prophet ﷺ is true, and I'm only saying that because I'm certain. I'm not saying that because I was born Muslim. You're just saying that because you're Pakistani. You're just saying that because you're Afghani. You're just saying that, because, what are you going to do? What else are you going to do on Eid? Right? It's not like that. We believe in Islam because it's true and criticable. And so if the Prophet ﷺ said something that does not make any sense, we will say he's not a prophet. But he never said anything that didn't make any sense. I will say, I think he said something that didn't make sense. And if I find categorically it doesn't make sense, he didn't say that. Okay, is it something new? Is this a 21st century Islam? No, that's what they've been doing since the whole time. The Sahaba, when they heard a hadith, it didn't make sense. They were like, what on earth is this? The Muhaddithin, when they heard that, for example, Abdul Shakur quotes all these hadiths, mashallah, every khutbah has hadiths that I never heard before. Lahu manakid, he got weird hadiths. They'll say that. And they'll keep hearing that he has hadiths that I've never heard before. They'll reject his hadiths. This is how it works. They didn't just say, oh, khair inshallah. It's a hadith, it must be true, so beautiful, mashallah. They used to Muhaddithin, if they knew somebody who was a bad narrator, what would they say about him? Salih, mashallah. I mean, he's a nice guy, right? Tim, nice but dim, right? You know that phrase? That's what they say about him. He's a nice guy. غَلَبَهُ الْعِبَادِ. He wasn't critical. Muhaddithin are critical. You can question every single thing. If you have a problem with Islam, question it. If there's a logical jump that doesn't make sense to you, I'll question it. Ask about it. Why is it that, for example, did Allah really say that men get more inheritance than women? Is it in the Quran? Show me. Show me that's what it means. Question it. Right? Every single thing can be questioned. And you break it down. In terms of authenticity, do you know the Prophet said it? Is it a fact? Is it strong evidence? Or is it a story? You can break it up very easily. Very easily. Very easily. That's what in Ibn Majah, that's what we do every week, right? We look at the hadith. Is it a fact? Most of them are not a fact. Most of them, we're looking here or here. Is it a story? Is it a weak hadith? Or is it strong? And even if it's strong, you're not going to leave Islam over it. So I can't, how could the Prophet ﷺ say that dogs are filthy? They're nice. They're nice. The Prophet ﷺ did not say dogs are not nice. He said or we think he said, that if a dog licks from a bowl, wash it 7 times. He didn't say dogs are not nice. That's a jump. Where did you get that from? Oh, but I love dogs. He didn't say that, Habibi. What are you talking about? So you make these assumptions. It's called a straw man argument. Straw man argument. Adil is obviously the stupidest person here. Look, he ran all the way from home. So that's a stupid thing to do, run here, you just drive, right? Or they have to drop you off. But that's not even true. So the argument that I'm ascribing to him is true. So then it disproves him. It's like, yeah, that's called a straw man argument. You make a straw man out of the person that you're talking about, and you knock that straw man over really easily, and that disproves him. You know? Muslims are obviously terrible. They're obviously the worst religion. Look, they're all terrorists. Are they all terrorists? No. There we go. But so that's called a straw man argument. And so work in a process. Number one, did the Prophet say it? Did the Prophet mean it? And number two, is your fact really a fact? Right? Is your fact really a fact? Right? So there's a lot of really lame arguments. You know, given that religion is all made up and religion is based on opinion, people believe this. People honestly religion is based on opinion. Religion is based on just being good and not thinking critical. No, it's not about that. When it comes to religion, there's no husna dhan, right? And inshallah, I'll close with a story just about criticism and sorry, people on YouTube, my battery is about to die. 3% left, inshallah. With Adil's dua, it will last. Without his dua, it won't last. So please make dua, Adil. The computer survives, right? Yeah, alhamdulillah. We're officially accepting bribes to keep the YouTube channel going. Joking. Okay, so it's just a story about being critical. Our religion is critical. So you have to have adab, right? But it doesn't mean you can't ask questions. Keep asking questions and you will find answers. Okay? And you'll feel very confident about things. If you don't ask questions, you'll always just be like this, oh, just ignore it, right? Just leave it like that and just have adab and forget adab. So there's a story. The story goes that Imam Ahmad was with Yahya ibn Ma'in. So the two hadith critics, they're called the Nuqad. Naqd means to critique something. So Yahya ibn Ma'in and Imam Ahmad are going to visit this scholar. I can't remember his name. And this scholar is accused of doing talqeen. What's talqeen? Is I'm a great hadith scholar. Sa'ad wants to narrate my hadith for me. So he comes to me and he reads my book to me and he never hears me reading the hadiths. So then he goes away and he says, Fareed narrated to me the following hadiths. Now, I didn't narrate those hadiths to Sa'ad. Sa'ad read them to me. So if Sa'ad read the wrong hadiths to me, Sa'ad was reading the wrong book and I couldn't even be bothered because I was like, yeah, telling my wife, oh, can you put it on the stove? While he's reading to me, okay, or I'm 80 years old and I can't even remember and I can't even hear what he's saying and I'm just, Yalla ibni go, Yalla. I've done this 50,000 times. So now, super scholar Fareed is now quoted from Sa'ad, who is good, and 2 generations later looks like a hadith. But actually that was never a hadith. So people like Imam Ahmad, what they would do is they'd find out, did you do talqeen or not? Right? They want to know that. So what did they do? Yahya ibn Ma'in says, we're going to test him. Imam Ahmad says, Ashan Allah, for God's sake, this is Sheikh so-and-so. We already know him. He doesn't do stuff like that. He's 100% legit. So Imam Ahmad has adab and says, we're not going to test him. Yahya ibn Ma'in says, we have to test him. So what does Yahya ibn Ma'in do? They write 30 hadiths. Every 10th hadith is not his hadith. So they said, you narrated to us 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. You narrated to us 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, so and they get to the 10th hadith. Now this sheikh is sitting here on a ledge. Imam Ahmad is in one hand and the other guy is here. And Imam Ahmad said, we're not going to test him. Don't test him. Just have some adab and just leave him alone. Yahya ibn Ma'in says, we've got to test him. So he quotes the hadith. He gets to hadith number 10 and the sheikh is aware. He's not just absent, telling his wife, oh, go and find that chicken that got lost. He's aware. He's listening very attentively. So it's meaningful. When people quote this sheikh, we know that he heard these hadiths one by one, exactly like that. And he wasn't just absent-mindedly saying, yeah, go ahead. And then people are going to quote him as a source, even though he wasn't even checking. Okay? So the 10th hadith is made up. So Yahya ibn Ma'in says, Sheikh, you told us X, Y, and Z. He says, yeah, Ibni, I didn't say that. My son, he's an old man, that's not my hadith, cross it off. Whatever, mistake. Hadith number 20. What are you talking about? That's not my hadith. He's aware. He's awake. So now we know that in 2 generations, when Imam Ahmad says we heard so-and-so, it means we heard him. Either I was reading to him and he was correcting me, or he was reading to me, so it's legit. He gets to hadith number 30. He goes, aha, I may be 80 years old, but I'm not stupid. So he's holding Imam Ahmad's hand in one side. He says, as for this guy, you have too much adab to do this. As for you, and he kicks him off the ledge, closes the door. And Imam Ahmad's like, astaghfirullah, what's going on? I told the guy, what on earth is he going to show? You know, we came all the way here from Khurasan, from wherever we came. We spent all this money traveling. We have the sheikh. Now the sheikh's going to, like, you just show disrespect to one of the awliya of Allah, one of the great ulama of Allah. I told you not do it. And now you are on the floor being kicked by a sheikh. Right? Would you like to be kicked by Sheikh Tamim Saad? Right? Imagine Sheikh Tamim kicks you out of your majlis and says, get out of my life. Right? What does Yahya Ma'in say? He says, it's worth it though, right? And he meant it. It was worth it. Because why? This is how the religion was preserved. By Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala creating certain people that had the guts to just keep pushing. And not just, oh, khair, inshallah. Khair, inshallah. No. That khair, that's when you're praying Taraweeh. Right? Have adab. Abdul Shakur makes a mistake. Ask him, tell him gently, say, bro, you skipped a page. Gently have adab, And he says, for example, no, I didn't. Khair, inshallah. We know he did, and you'll find out tomorrow when he's in Muraja. That's adab. That's between people. That's between you and your wife. Inshallah, yeah, thank you, I know you didn't mean it. That's fine. But when it comes to ilm, it's not like that. When it comes to ilm, it's not like that. It's not like that. Deen is not based on being nice. Deen is being critical. That's how the deen survived. Is that a fact what you're saying, or is it not a fact? Okay, then it's not a fact. Scratch it off. When we study Aqidah, for example, we go through the lists of facts. Right? We go through lists of facts. Aqidah is very basic because the facts about Islam are very basic. When we deal with fiqh, we're dealing with what is most likely.